The candles in the committee anteroom were already burning low when Edwina Hartley set her father's ledger on the table and placed both hands flat against the cover, as though steadying something alive. The room smelled of coal smoke and old wool and the particular anxious sweat of men who believed a woman had no business being in it. 3 members of the Select Committee on Public Accounts sat across from her, their faces arranged in expressions that ranged from skepticism to open affront. The 4th chair was empty. She had been told Lord Edmund Vane, Viscount Ashford, would not attend. She had come anyway. The ledger was bound in brown calfskin, its spine soft with handling, its pages dense with her father's small, careful script. George Hartley had kept his accounts in the manner of a man who believed that numbers, unlike men, could not lie if properly observed. He had trained his daughter in the same faith. She had carried this book from his study in Cheapside the morning after his death, wrapped in her second shawl because she had nothing else adequate to the purpose, and she had kept it for 11 months without once opening it in front of another person, because she had known for 11 months that no one would believe her, and she had not yet found the one person who might. She had found him last week. She was not certain he would come today. She opened the ledger to the page she had marked with a strip of blue ribbon and began to speak. The season of 1815 had opened in the usual fashion, which is to say, it had opened like a wound that nobody in the room acknowledged as one. The great houses aired their curtains, the modistes raised their prices, and the daughters of England were fitted and polished and presented in the knowledge that the market was open, and their value would be assessed in candle-lit rooms by people who would never once ask them what they thought. Edwina arrived in London in the 2nd week of April, not as a daughter being presented, but as a paid companion to Mrs. Adelaide Quill, a widow of moderate fortune and considerable nerves, who required someone sensible to manage her correspondence, accompany her nieces to their fittings, and prevent her from losing her reticule at assemblies. The wage was £12 a year. It was enough to keep Edwina fed, housed in a small room above the servants' stair, and invisible, which was precisely what she needed. She was 23 years old. She had a plain face that rewarded sustained attention more than it invited a first glance, and she had long since stopped expecting first glances. Her gown for the season's opening ball at Marchmont House was a gray silk remade from one of her mother's, the lace at the cuffs replaced twice and still showing the ghost of an earlier trim along the hem. She wore no jewels because she owned none worth the wearing. She carried a small ivory fan that had been her mother's as well, its sticks worn smooth at the pivot where her thumb habitually rested. The ballroom at Marchmont House was everything her gown was not. The chandeliers held 200 candles apiece, and they made the room into a kind of burning noon at midnight, and every woman with a decent jewel box had opened it for the occasion. Diamonds caught and scattered the light like living things. Edwina stood at the edge of the 2nd tier with Mrs. Quill's wrap over her arm, and noted the reflections moving across the marble floor, and thought, with a wryness she did not permit herself to voice, that the floor at least made no distinctions between what it reflected. It was there that she first saw Lord Edmund Vane clearly, though she had known his name and his work for more than a year by then. She had known his name since the morning a parliamentary courier had delivered the censure motion to her father's chambers in the spring of 1814, and she had known it with the particular quality of knowledge that lives in the chest rather than the mind. Edmund Vane was the member who had risen before the Select Committee and named George Hartley as the man responsible for the forged contract in the Midlands Canal account, the fraudulent deduction of £3,200 from the Public Works Fund that had very nearly ruined 2 parishes and had certainly ruined 1 solicitor. Her father had not recovered from it. He had died in January 1815, 9 months after the censure, with the case still unresolved and his name still attached to it, and Edwina had stood at his grave and felt not the soft grief of natural loss, but the sharper grief of a man taken before the record could be corrected. Edmund himself was not what she had expected, which was itself a species of insult, because she had expected something she could despise at a comfortable distance. He was tall and held himself with the careful economy of a man accustomed to being watched, his face offering very little to anyone who looked at it. His jaw was square, and his eyes were the color of flint in low light, and his dress was immaculate in the manner of a man who treated appearance as a form of discipline rather than display. He stood at the far end of the room in conversation with two other members of the committee, and he did not smile, and he did not scan the room, and he gave every impression of a man who found the ballroom merely inconvenient rather than pleasurable. Lady Dorothea Vane materialized at his left elbow with the smooth efficiency of long practice. She was a woman of perhaps 55, handsome in the architectural way of women who have never once doubted their structural soundness, and she wore a quantity of sapphires that established her position in the room more thoroughly than any introduction could have done. She brought with her Miss Cecily Farrow, who was everything the current season required: fair, composed, brilliantly jeweled, and possessed of a smile calibrated to land on the right faces at the right moments. Cecily's eyes found Edmund with the particular directness of a woman who has been told she is the correct answer to a question and has never had reason to doubt it. Edwina would have remained perfectly invisible through the entire exchange had Mrs. Quill not chosen that moment to misplace her wrap, the very one Edwina was already carrying, and had announced this loss in a tone audible to the 12 people standing nearest. Edwina stepped forward, laid the wrap across her employer's shoulders, and made to step back. She did not step back quickly enough. Dorothea's gaze found her in the moment of her stepping forward, catalogued her in the gray remade gown with the twice-replaced lace, and spoke to her companion in a voice pitched to carry precisely as far as it needed to carry. "George Hartley's daughter," Dorothea said, still clinging to the season. "One does admire the persistence, even when the enterprise is entirely without basis." Cecily made a small sound, not quite a laugh, that was more damaging than a direct reply would have been. Edmund Vane turned. He looked at Edwina with the same unreadable quality he'd given the room at large, and she waited for his face to do what faces always did when they recognized her father's name in hers. There was a short interval in which she could not read him. Then he said, with the measured flatness of a man issuing a parliamentary correction rather than a social remark, "This is neither the time nor the occasion for Miss Hartley's family circumstances to be rehearsed. I would ask you to confine yourself to the present company." He was addressing Dorothea. He said it directly to Dorothea. He did not say it kindly. He said it in the voice of a man removing an inconvenient piece of business from the table, and Edwina recognized immediately that she was still, in his accounting, business rather than a person. He had not defended her. He had imposed order. She dipped her chin in the smallest acknowledgement she could manage and moved back to her station beside Mrs. Quill, and she did not look at him again for the remainder of the evening, and she did not permit herself to wonder what the interval before his correction had contained. She did not have the luxury of wondering. She had £12 a year, and a ledger and a dead father, and no sponsor, and the season would proceed indifferently whether she spent her attention wisely or not. The weeks that followed were the particular kind of exhausting that women in her position understood and could not name to the people who employed them. She attended Mrs. Quill to 3 assemblies, 2 card parties, a concert at Hanover Square, and the kind of small drawing-room gatherings where everyone present knew precisely where everyone else stood in the hierarchical accounting of the season, and the knowledge made everyone slightly worse, At each occasion, she heard her father's name used in the manner of a cautionary reference, the way one names a failed investment to illustrate a principle. "Hartley's girl," said one of Mrs. Quill's acquaintances at a card party in Brook Street, examining Edwina across the table with the disinterested attention one gives a curiosity at a museum. "Still at it, is she? Well, what else would she do?" The second voicing arrived without ceremony, as the worst ones did. It was at a dinner at the Sefton House in Grosvenor Square, a gathering of sufficient consequence that Edwina had been placed below the salt and given a chair that rocked slightly on one leg. She had managed the chair without incident for 2 courses. The third course produced a conversation at the near end of the table about parliamentary accountability, and a gentleman named Mr. Holt, who had been on the committee periphery in 1814, turned toward her end of the table and said with the cheerful cruelty of a man who has genuinely forgotten that cruelty is what it is, "The Hartley fraud. That was a clean piece of work by Vane's committee. Was it not? Took a tangled matter and made it plain. The man had the figures right there in the public account, and still attempted the deception. £3,200. Rather a brazen sum." He had smiled when he said it. He had no idea she was the daughter of the man he was describing. Or perhaps he had some idea and found it made the story tidier. Edwina held the ivory fan in her lap and ran her thumb along the worn pivot and said nothing. She ate her third course without tasting it, and listened to 2 other people contribute corroborating details about her father's guilt that were each wrong in a specific way she could have corrected and did not. What saved her in that period was not patience, though she had patience enough. What saved her was the work. Mrs. Quill's household was managed by a thin-shouldered woman named Mrs. Peel, who kept the domestic accounts in a green ledger that lived on the second shelf of the housekeeper's room. And it was while reviewing a month's household accounts on Mrs. Quill's behalf that Edwina found the entry that changed the shape of the remaining weeks. It was a single line in the column for kitchen supplies, a delivery of coal recorded at 14 shillings above the standard rate, and the notation in the margin attributed the difference to the footman, James, who was responsible for signing off on deliveries. The notation was in a hand that was not James's. Edwina knew James's hand from 3 weeks of correspondence because she had written 2 letters at his direction to his sister in Bristol, and the pen pressure was wrong and the capital J was formed differently. She sat with the ledger open on Mrs. Peel's table for a long moment, running the implication forward. 14 shillings was not a sum to destroy a man over, but 14 shillings attributed falsely to a footman in a household account was the beginning of a pattern. And a pattern of that kind, once established, grew until it was adequate to the purpose. She had seen it before. Her father had taught her to see it. She found James in the back passage the following morning, and showed him the entry without preamble. He went pale in a way that confirmed she had read the situation correctly. She told him she had no intention of reporting it to Mrs. Quill, and that if the entry was corrected before the monthly accounts were reviewed, no further action would be required. She showed him precisely where and how the correction should be made. She asked for nothing in return. She did this because it was the right thing to do, and because she had lived inside the consequences of a false account entry long enough to know what they cost. She did not know that Edmund Vane had called on Mrs. Quill that morning regarding a charitable subscription and had been conducted through the house to await Mrs. Quill in the back sitting room, which shared a wall with the passage where Edwina stood with the open ledger. She did not know he had heard every word. She discovered he had been there only when she passed through the hall 20 minutes later and found him standing at the window with his hat in his hands. And he turned when she entered and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully categorize. It was not warmth, precisely. It was something more careful than warmth. The expression of a man revising a calculation and finding the revised figure less comfortable than the original. "Miss Hartley," he said. "My lord," she said, and kept walking. He turned back to the window without another word. She felt the back of her neck prickling for the remainder of the morning without understanding why, and attributed it to the cold. He called again 3 days later. Mrs. Quill received him with great satisfaction, there being very little in the domestic routine that a Viscountcy could not improve, and Edwina arranged tea and sat in her usual chair near the door in her usual position of near invisibility, and listened to Edmund speak about the Canal Bill before Parliament with the same precise economy he applied to everything. He did not address her. He did not ignore her in the pointed way that meant she had been noticed. It was a different quality of inattention, and she distrusted it. The fourth visit produced a conversation. He arrived when Mrs. Quill was indisposed, and the niece, Miss Fanny Quill, was receiving instruction from her music master, and there was a moment of conversational awkwardness in the drawing-room, during which Edwina had the choice of maintaining a silence that would have been rude or speaking, and she spoke. She told him she had recently reviewed the amended parliamentary report on the Midlands Canal account and found 2 procedural inconsistencies in the documentation of witness statements. She said it the way she said most things, quietly and precisely, as though she were discussing the weather and not directly criticizing the work of a committee of which he had been a leading member. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Which inconsistencies?" She told him. He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, in the flat, controlled way of a man whose voice has been trained not to betray him, "How did you come to review that report?" "My father taught me that a discredited account is not the same as a false one," she said. "The first is a social verdict. The second is a mathematical one." His face did something she could not read. He said, "Your father's ledger. You have mentioned it." She had not mentioned it. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She held his gaze and waited for the space in the conversation where she would discover what he intended. And the space arrived, and he said, "I signed the censure motion in March 1814. My son had died in January of that year. I read the committee report, and I signed it, and I did not look carefully enough at the underlying documentation." He said it in the manner of a man delivering a judgment against himself, without plea or mitigation, the words precise and level, and carrying the specific weight of something that had been rehearsed in private many times before being said aloud for the first time. I have not previously said so to anyone. She understood then what she was looking at. The coldness was not cruelty. It was a man wearing propriety over a wound that had never properly closed, moving through the world with the careful discipline of someone who knows that if the discipline drops, the wound will be visible to everyone, and he has decided the wound is not something the world has earned the right to see. His son had been 3 years old when he died. She learned this afterward. From a small stone in a corner of St. George's churchyard that Edmund visited on Thursday mornings, which she knew because she had seen him there once when she took Mrs. Quill's niece for a constitutional, and he had not seen her, and she had watched him stand at the stone for several minutes, with his hat at his side and his face entirely unguarded. She thought of that face for a long time afterward. She thought of it when the other thing happened. Dorothea moved against her in the 3rd week of May, which Edwina had anticipated without being able to prevent it. She had watched the dowager's attention sharpening across the preceding weeks, had caught the quality of Dorothea's observation at 2 separate social occasions, and had recognized in it the focused interest of a woman who has identified a problem and is working toward its resolution. She had not understood the full geometry of the problem until a letter arrived from Mrs. Quill on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Edwina's room with the particular formality that meant the contents were uncomfortable for the sender. Mrs. Quill had received a call from Lady Dorothea Vane. Lady Dorothea had, in the gentlest possible terms, brought to Mrs. Quill's attention certain matters regarding the character and family history of her current companion. The letter did not specify what had been said, but its effect was evident in every line. Edwina's position was untenable, her tenure was concluded, and a week's wages in lieu of notice was enclosed. £12 a year worked out to 4 shillings and 6 pence per week, and Edwina held the coins in her palm for a moment and noted that they were the precise weight of nothing. She found herself in the drawing room at the Ashworth house that same afternoon, having accepted an invitation that had been extended before the letter arrived, and feeling, with some clarity, that she had nothing left to lose by attending. It was a small gathering, and she arrived as what she now was, rather than what she had been that morning, which is to say she arrived as George Hartley's daughter and nothing else, without the buffer of employment or position to absorb the impact of that designation. Dorothea was there. Cecily was there. Positioned at Dorothea's right hand with the composed attention of a woman confident that the room's verdict was aligned with her own. Edmund was not. His absence was noted in Edwina's chest as an absence specifically, which annoyed her because she had not given herself permission to feel his presence as something she was entitled to rely upon. The moment arrived in the way these moments do, which is to say it arrived as an interruption to a conversation about something else entirely. Dorothea turned from a discussion of the upcoming Vauxhall entertainment and said, in a voice pitched at the full carrying register of a woman who understands acoustics, "Miss Hartley, I wonder if you might satisfy my curiosity. Your father was the solicitor in the Midlands matter, the parliamentary censure of 1814. Are you still attempting to relitigate that affair, or have you accepted the committee's findings?" The room turned. It turned in the way rooms turn when someone has said the thing that everyone present understood might be said and nobody expected to actually hear said in that particular way at that particular moment. Edwina felt 12 faces arrange themselves in her direction and felt the familiar sensation of being the center of an attention that carried no warmth, the sensation of being appraised by people who had already reached their verdict and were merely confirming it. She thought about her father's handwriting. She thought about the 14 shillings. She thought about the specific quality of Edmund's voice when he had said he had not looked carefully enough at the documentation. And she thought about the small stone in St. George's churchyard. "My father was not guilty," she said, with great precision and no elevation of volume. "I have the proof of it, and I intend, by the end of this week, to place that proof before the committee." The room held the silence it produced. Dorothea's expression shifted by perhaps 1/16 of an inch in the direction of calculation, which told Edwina everything she needed to know about who had arranged the original forgery and why. She left before the conversation could resume. She walked back to the small room above Mrs. Quill's servant's stair, which was still technically hers until the end of the week, and she took the ledger from the flat bottom of her traveling chest, where she had kept it wrapped in the second shawl for 11 months. And she sat down at the narrow writing table and opened it to the page her father had annotated in October 1813, 4 months before the accusation arrived, and 6 months before his name appeared in a parliamentary record in a manner that ended his life's work in a single session. The annotations were in his hand. She had supplemented them with her own notes across the preceding year, tracing the chain of account entries from the forged originals back to a clerk named Silas Croft, whose hand she had identified in 3 separate documents by the characteristic way he formed the numeral 4, the same small habitual error her father had noted in his own margin before his death. She had written to the committee clerk 3 weeks ago requesting an audience. She had received no reply. The ledger represented the only argument she had, and she intended to make it. She presented it on Thursday morning, arriving at the committee anteroom at 9 o'clock with the ledger under her arm and the strip of blue ribbon marking the annotated page. The 3 committee members who had agreed to receive her did so with the collective expression of men who have agreed to hear a woman speak because the alternative would be impolitic, and who intend to do as little as possible with what she says. She had expected this. She opened the ledger, and she did not waste their time, and she did not ask for their approval. She showed them the figures. She showed them the hand. She placed Croft's name and his characteristic numeral 4 alongside the forged entry, and explained, in the language of account-keeping her father had given her, precisely how the fraud had worked, what it had taken, and who it had cost. She was midway through the second annotation when the anteroom door opened. Edmund Vane entered without announcement, which suggested he had sufficient authority in this building to arrive when he chose, and sufficient reason to choose this particular morning. He was in full parliamentary dress, which she had not seen before, and it gave him an additional quality of formality that she found she needed to discount deliberately in order to continue reading from the ledger. He stood at the back of the room. She did not look up from the page. She finished the entry she had been reading and turned to the page with the blue ribbon and presented the central argument, which was that the entry attributing £3,200 of falsified canal expenses to George Hartley had been made in a hand not consistent with her father's throughout the preceding 10 years of records, and that this hand was consistent across 3 other documents originating from Silas Croft's position as assistant to the committee's second clerk in 1813. She closed the ledger. One of the 3 committee members said that the matter had been fully settled in 1814. A second said that the provenance of the ledger could not be independently verified. The third said nothing, but looked at Edmund. Edmund crossed the room in the manner of a man who has made a decision prior to the room and is walking toward its execution rather than away from it. He took his position at the table beside Edwina, which was not a position anyone had assigned him, and he addressed his colleagues with the level directness of a man who has cleared his books and is prepared to present the final figure. "The ledger's provenance is verified by me," he said. "I reviewed the document 2 days ago at Miss Hartley's request. The handwriting analysis is consistent with a secondary examination I commissioned from a document clerk at Lincoln's Inn, whose report is in my possession and is available to the committee. The forged entry in the canal account was prepared by Silas Croft, who was dismissed from his position in November 1814 for an unrelated discrepancy and is currently resident in Leeds. I have arranged for the committee clerk to take his statement." He paused for precisely 1 beat, as a man pauses when he has arrived at the line that requires more care than the preceding ones. "The censure motion against George Hartley was signed by me in error. The error was mine. The record should reflect that the censure is withdrawn and that Mr. Hartley's account of the matter was correct." The room held itself very still. Edwina had prepared for a great many possible outcomes in the preceding weeks. She had prepared for refusal, for dismissal, for polite interest that produced no action, for the kind of procedural sympathy that substituted for justice in rooms like this one. She had not prepared for this with sufficient precision, and she felt the inadequacy of her preparation in the base of her throat and in the palms of her hands, where they were pressed flat against the calfskin cover of the ledger. Edmund turned toward her. He said her name. Not Miss Hartley, her given name, which was itself a kind of argument in a room of this kind, spoken before 3 parliamentary committee members who had just heard him attach his own reputation to hers. "Edwina," he said, "your father was right. I should have seen it sooner." One of the 3 members cleared his throat and said that the committee would need to review the Lincoln's Inn report before any formal amendment could be entered. Edmund said, with great patience, that they were welcome to review it at their leisure and that he would return on Monday with the full documentation. He then turned to Edwina and said in the lower register, he used when the audience was reduced to the relevant parties, "Come, I will take you home." She looked at him for a moment with everything she had kept unsaid across the preceding weeks arranged behind her face, and he looked back at her with his jaw set and his eyes steady, and something present in his expression that had not been there at Marchmont House on the first night of the season, something that was not the cold imposition of order, but its opposite. The particular quality of a man who has stopped performing containment and is simply present in the room. She picked up the ledger. She went with him. Dorothea, it transpired, had known about Croft for considerably longer than she had allowed Edmund to understand. This emerged over the following days as Edmund pursued the documentation he had promised the committee, and it emerged in the manner of things that have been kept in careful equilibrium for a long time and then encounter a single unsupportable weight. The weight in this case was the Lincoln's Inn clerk's report, which established Croft's handwriting beyond procedural doubt, and the subsequent interview with Croft himself, who was a man of limited resilience under direct questioning, and who had, within 30 minutes of Edmund's arrival in Leeds, provided a statement that named the person who had asked him to prepare the forged entry in exchange for a payment of £25, paid in 2 installments, the second of which had been arranged through a household account at an address in Curzon Street that belonged to Lady Dorothea Vane. Edmund received this information at 8 in the morning in the front room of a coaching inn in Leeds. He sat with it for some time. He had trusted Dorothea in the manner of a man who extends trust to family, because the alternative requires more energy than grief permits. He had been wrong about more than Hartley's ledger. He understood, sitting in that coaching inn with Croft's statement in his hands, that the forgery had been arranged specifically to remove a solicitor who had discovered a separate set of irregularities in the canal account that would have reflected poorly on a member of Dorothea's social circle, and that his own signature on the censure motion had been the mechanism by which that removal was accomplished. He had been used in the manner of a good instrument, used by a bad hand, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest with the particular weight of something that cannot be undone, but must nonetheless be carried. He returned to London. He attended Dorothea in her drawing-room in Curzon Street, and laid Croft's statement on the table between them, and said nothing for a long moment. Dorothea looked at the statement with the expression of a woman calculating how much of the structure was still salvageable. Very little of it, her face concluded. Edmund said quietly and with complete precision that she would withdraw from the season immediately and retire to the family estate in Derbyshire, that she would make no further attempt to interfere in Miss Hartley's affairs or reputation, and that the matter of the £25 and its origins would not be aired publicly provided she complied with these conditions. He was not warm when he said it. He was not cold either. He was simply finished, in the way a man is finished who has discovered that the cold he wore was someone else's design. Cecily Farrow, hearing of Dorothea's abrupt departure through the usual channels, understood that the season's arithmetic had shifted irrevocably, and made the adjustment that a sensible woman makes when the primary patron of her social campaign has removed herself from the field. She was last seen at a musical evening in Portman Square, directing a very creditable smile at a baronet from Somerset. Edwina hoped she would be content. She thought she probably would be. The Parliamentary Committee met on the following Monday and entered the amendment in the public record. The censure against George Hartley, solicitor, was formally withdrawn. The record noted an error in the original proceedings attributable to falsified documentation and named Silas Croft as the instrument of the fraud. Edmund's name remained on the original censure motion because that was the truth of what had happened, but the motion itself was reversed. which was the more important truth. Edwina was not present for the formal session. She had been invited, but she had declined, because she had found in the preceding days that the presence of witnesses at the moment of formal vindication mattered less to her than she had expected. What she had wanted for 11 months was for the record to be corrected. The correction had been made. The manner of its making was already established. She did not need to watch it. She was in the garden of Mrs. Quill's house, which she was still inhabiting at Mrs. Quill's insistence, and somewhat to her own surprise, when Edmund came to find her on the Monday afternoon. The garden was a narrow city garden with a gravel path, and 2 plane trees and a stone bench that was cold in May, but serviceable. He found her sitting on the bench with the ledger in her lap, turned to the blue-ribboned page, and he sat down beside her without preamble and without asking permission, which was entirely characteristic. They sat without speaking for a length of time that was not uncomfortable. The plane trees moved in the slight afternoon wind. A house sparrow made a determined investigation of the gravel near Edmund's boot, and was not discouraged. He said, "I have spoken to my solicitor." She waited. "I have asked him to prepare the documentation for a proposal of marriage," he said, "if you will allow it." She looked at him. He was looking at the plane trees, which had the slightly formal quality of a man conducting a difficult proceeding with as much dignity as the proceeding will accommodate. She said, "You are aware that I have £12 a year, and a reputation that has spent 11 months being publicly compared to a parliamentary fraud case." "I am aware," he said. "I am also aware that you identified a forged entry in a household account to protect a footman you did not know, refused the correction's reward, presented a case before a parliamentary committee that 3 men twice your age refused to hear, and taught yourself account-keeping well enough to identify the specific handwriting of a fraud across a 3-year document trail." He paused. "I am aware of rather a great deal about you, Miss Hartley. I have been aware of it for some time." The quality of that sentence settled into the garden's quiet. She thought about the first night at Marchmont House, the gray gown among the diamonds, the back of her neck prickling for a reason she had attributed to the cold. She thought about Dorothea's voice at the drawing-room gathering, the bright, sharp attention of 12 faces, and the weight of standing in the center of that attention, with nothing left to lose, and a precise sentence to deliver. She thought about the 11 months of the ledger's weight under the second shawl in the flat bottom of her traveling chest. She said, "Yes." He turned from the plane trees. The expression on his face was not triumph, and it was not relief precisely. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a calculation for a long time and has just arrived at a figure that resolves it. The sparrow investigated his boot, found nothing of interest, and departed. They were married in June at St. George's, Hanover Square, which was the church where his son's small stone stood in the corner of the churchyard. Edwina wore ivory with a trim of pale gold ribbon, which was not gray, and she wore her mother's ivory fan at her wrist and felt the worn pivot under her thumb as she had felt it in every public room of the season, except that this time the worn place was comfort rather than ballast. Edmund said his vows in the same level voice he applied to everything important, with no ceremony of emotion in the delivery and no absence of it underneath. Mrs. Quill wept productively. James the footman, who had been invited at Edwina's specific request, stood at the back of the church with a correctness of bearing that suggested he understood the occasion's weight. Fanny Quill dropped her prayer book and retrieved it with the philosophical equanimity of a young woman accustomed to the minor turbulences of family ceremony. They went to Ashford House in Derbyshire in August, after the London heat had made the city unpleasant, and after Edmund had attended 2 further committee sessions to confirm the closure of the Hartley matter. Ashford House was older than Edwina had imagined, which is to say it was very old indeed, the kind of house that has been added to across several generations so that the original core sits inside a succession of later ideas, like a set of practical shells. The stone was pale, and the windows were tall, and the library faced north, which was where she first understood that she would be content. Here, in the way one is content, when a room is built at the right scale for the life one actually intends to live. She placed her father's ledger in the escritoire in the library. Not as evidence, not as a case file. She placed it as what it was, which was the work of a man who believed that numbers could not lie if properly observed, and who had trained his daughter in the same careful faith, and whose name had been entered correctly in the record of the country he had served. The escritoire was mahogany, with a brass pull on the drawer, and the drawer closed with a small clean click that she found entirely adequate. By December, the snow had come early to Derbyshire. Edwina stood at the north window of the library with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and watched the snow move through the yard where the stone wall met the kitchen garden, and she thought about the specific weight of the ledger under the second shawl in the flat bottom of the chest, and how long she had carried it, and how it felt to set it down in a room that was hers. Edmund came to stand beside her. He did not speak, because the window did not require speech. And he had learned by then, or perhaps had always known, that some things are held rather than said. His hand found hers at her side. The candles on the library table behind them cast the room's reflection faintly against the dark glass, overlaid on the snow and the yard and the kitchen garden wall, and Edwina looked at the two of them standing there in the window's cold reflection and felt the specific satisfaction of a record correctly kept. The snow fell. The house held them. If Edwina's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. We will be back with another.